Marisha here, and sometimes people back home ask me if I'm going to adopt a British accent or in other ways change my speech because I'm over here now. And the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, my speech is going to change in some ways because speech always changes based on the circumstances. You don't have to go abroad to know this. Just think about the ways that you talk to your friends versus the ways that you talk to your grandparents versus the way that you speak to your boss, for example. We all understand that we have shifts in the vocabulary that we use or the frequency with which we talk or sometimes even the cadence with which we speak, depending on the situation. So, of course, there are going to be ways in which my speech shifts over here. But I am very intentionally retaining my American accent. Could I pull a Sandy Toksvig and adopt a passable British accent while I'm over here? Probably. But there's no compelling reason for me to do that. Having an American accent, well, yes, there are times it can be a disadvantage if you run into someone who happens to have like a weird chip on their shoulder about Americans or is going to go straight for politics, like I talked about in a previous video. But the vast majority of the time, it's an advantage because it's exotic. And that's a really strange thing for Americans to hear because we're aware of the fact that with Hollywood films and television being, exported all around the world, people are sort of used to hearing an American accent, but it's very different to hear it in a film versus being exposed to it in real life in um on like a regular basis. And so even though there are plenty of Americans in London and, people obviously have heard an American accent before, it still has an exoticism to it. For example, when I was a student teacher in Australia, my students kind of hung on every word because they viewed my accent as exotic. And they said, "Oh, I love your accent, miss." Um, so it does have a little bit of that going for it. And even for people who aren't, like, ooh, an American accent, right? When they hear it's an American accent, it very easily facilitates further small talk and like the initial stages of getting to know someone. Because as soon as they hear American, then it doesn't take a genius, like a conversational genius, to come up with, well, where in America are you from? And oh, I've been to fill in the blank to where in America they have been, usually New York City, maybe LA, very infrequently Michigan. Um, and what brought you over here, right? It's very, very easy for people to talk to me then when they hear that I'm American. um, Both because those are questions that you would ask anybody who's not from your country, right? Like, oh, well, where in your home country are you from and what brings you here? And if you happen to have any sort of connection to that country, like, oh, I visited that country, whatever. Very easy questions. But also, I would guess in some ways, the stereotype of Americans being oversharers can be an advantage in this situation, that people feel like they can maybe talk to you more, ask you questions they wouldn't necessarily ask a Brit because they assume you're going to be more willing to talk. Um, and then I also would like to think that if I find myself in a situation where there's like miscommunication because I don't understand, you know, a phrase that's being used, or they're using a different word that I'm not used to for something, that there is then obviously a bit of grace extended because they understand, oh, she's, not from here. She doesn't, oh yeah, Americans say this instead or whatever. And then also, there's a little bit of hope that maybe there's a guy out there for me who thinks that American accents are sexy. Let's fingers crossed there. So it really, I think, behooves me to retain an American accent. And I would say that I also intentionally retain many of the American words for things as opposed to adopting like the British word for something. Part of that is just like, obviously my bias of this is the word that I've always used and this makes the most sense to me. There are some instances where I've actually thought about something and it's like, oh no, actually the American word is better. Um, Oftentimes the American word was originally the British word and the British are the ones who changed. So for example, because it's October, fall, modern Britons insist on saying autumn, and if you go online you'll see some of them like have like a weird chip on their shoulder about Americans saying fall, but fall was originally used by the British. um, they're the ones who changed, and that's true of a lot of things. And then there are other instances where I retain the American word for something. um, Again, usually the first reason why I'm retaining it is just that's what I'm used to. But if I wanted to get into a fight with someone about it, I would also argue that the American word is taken from another language, and American English is much more representative of who we are as a nation of immigrants. So when you look at, for example, the British chose to use the French word courgette, and Americans use the Italian word zucchini, or the British use the French word biscuit. I think biscuit is French and not also Dutch. I think it's French, but the American word cookie is from Dutch, right? So you have like obviously in the States you have much more influence from other countries based on waves of immigration. So you have like German and Dutch and Italian um, influences, especially like culinary influences when we're talking about like food differences. Another one, for example, is rocket. So Brits use rocket, which comes from the French word for that leafy substance, and Americans are like rocket. What is she even talking about? We call it arugula, right? We use the Italian word. Um, so I like the idea of retaining kind of that diversity of etymology that is a part of American English. And to be honest, for most things, it's easy to retain the American word because you don't use it often enough that you would get exposed to the British word. Like I don't think I've ever actually heard a Brit say rocket over here. You just don't. I mean, like you're not eating tons of arugula where like it comes up. Um, but there are instances where I have adopted the British word or phrase for something because I like them better, or maybe there's not an equivalent in the States. So I'm going to finish this by giving you some examples of British words and phrases that I have adopted. The first one is tat, and tat just means like junk. So to use it in a sentence, you would say something like, don't buy souvenirs from the shops in Leicester Square. It's all just a bunch of tat made in China. It's just such a great like short little word with a little bit of a zip to it. Just like, oh, it's just a bunch of tat, right? I like it better than junk. I mean, junk is a good word too, but I've adopted tat. Um, I also now say the tube. When I was here for several months, I still referred to it as the metro because I was coming from DC where it's called the metro. And to be fair, the publication that you get for free in every tube station is called Metro. Um, but I've been here long enough that tube has worn off on me. And I don't have a horse in this race. There's no compelling reason to retain the word metro. So I use tube now. Um, a phrase that I have picked up that I love is to be caught short. And to be caught short means to need the bathroom very urgently, often in the context of you're worried you might not make it. So, real life example of how you might use this phrase. I was volunteering for an event at church, but I started to have some gastrointestinal issues and I felt unwell. So I took a taxi home because I was afraid if I walked the half hour home, I would get caught short. And then finally, I have adopted the adjective Moorish. And Moorish is similar to our noun s'mores, which they don't really have here because they don't have graham crackers. But anyway, basically playing off the word more to mean that you want more of something. So Moorish is used to describe any food that is tasty and you want to eat more of. And it's very fun to see a British person try something and go, ooh, that's Moorish. So I've adopted that for myself when I'm talking about something that is particularly toothsome. And on that note, my next video, barring any, mishaps with grocery shopping, will be about some British snacks that I find Moorish. In the meantime, like, subscribe, tell your friends how gnarly this channel is, and I'll see you next time.